Cabinet of Curiosities is the newest anthology horror series by none other than Gillermo del Toro, one of the most popular directors working today. Bizarre nightmares unfold in 8 tales of terror in a visually stunning, spine-tingling horror collection cured by this very man himself. Now, I would be lying if I sat here and said I'm familiar with his work, because I'm not. I quite recently became a huge cinema nerd, so I have a lot to catch up to. I could not escape, however, many people saying all over social media that this is one director they trust with picking the best director for each episode and with the best possible story that will express his vision. From what I could gather generally, he is known for putting a spin on every genre he ever touches. He doesn't do your typical run-of-the-mill horror story, but mixes it with other genres and elements that switch on you before you can properly realize what's going on. That might work for some and totally miss for others. Hence why this series also received extremely mixed but mostly mid reviews. Most people seem to think it's fine, but nothing more than that. In today's video, I will be ranking and reviewing each of the 8 episodes from my least favorite to my favorite, because that's how rankings usually work, and at the end, I'll let you know my overall thoughts on the series as a whole. If you haven't seen it yet, I would suggest you leave this video on the side and come back after you watched it in its entirety, because I will be including spoilers, so I can truly talk about everything that I have on my mind, because there is a lot, trust me. With that now out of the way, let's start at the very bottom of my list with number 8. Pigman's Model, directed by Keith Roberts. Art student Will meets introvert Richard, whose terrifying works of art begin to have a deeply disturbing effect on Will's sense of reality. Yes, it's a possessed painting story, and I can't possibly begin to express to you how tired I am of this trope. I love art, and especially paintings. I studied art history in high school, wish I didn't have 2 left hands and could actually paint myself. I am completely aware that these types of stories can be told really well. It's just that the subgenre of possession horror doesn't work for me, and I simply don't enjoy it as much as many other people seem to. Mostly because I feel like there are no new ideas being brought to the table at the moment, and this episode proves that entirely. Not only is it extremely slow paced and hands down boring until the 3rd act begins, but I also found its storyline messy and confusing. Literally once it ended, I had absolutely no idea what I was supposed to take from this. The horror was mid, the horror reveal more than expected, and the characters as flat as they come. I didn't find Pigman mysterious, and not for a single second did I want to discover why the hell his paintings are possessed and are making our protagonist's life a living hell. You also better believe I didn't even flinch when he got eaten by the entity, because I couldn't give less of a fuck. The only truly spine-chilling moment was when the protagonist came home, and not only were his wife's eyes scraped out, but his son's head was being cooked in the oven. One and only scene that shocked me and made me realize I'm actually supposed to be scared. I can't exactly pinpoint why the story worked for me a lot less than it did for others who've seen it, but I guess it wasn't made for me. This is the only episode I can truly say I entirely disliked, and just thinking about it makes me never want to watch another possession movie ever again. My personal rating for this one is 3 out of 10, and even that feels a tiny bit too generous. Let's move on though to number 7, where we have The Murmuring, directed by Jennifer Kent. If the name sounds familiar, that's because she did indeed direct The Babadook, which I have yet to see. Mourning a major loss, ornithologists Nancy and Edgar flock to a secluded home to study birds, but the house's history reveals heartbreak and horror. Listen, I can appreciate a story about grief at any point in time, although I am blessed to not be able to relate to dealing with such major loss yet at this point in my life. I think this is one of the many reasons why this didn't work for me well and was very mid. I love the setting and all of the metaphors thrown in there that you had to decode even after the episode was already over. It definitely got me thinking, and that's great, but not enough when the story simply fails to bring anything new to the table. This entire episode felt like rehashed horror cliches being thrown in for the sake of having any horror present at all. It wasn't original, well done, or interesting in any way. I mean, just from the first probably 15 minutes, you can realize how it's going to end, and I can't lie. That got me bored, and the middle part dragged like hell. Performances from both leads and pretty much only characters in this episode were the ones that kept me going, or I would need a few sittings to get through it. I love how you don't exactly know what happened to them till way into the episode, you just simply know it was tragic and heartbreaking. It's later that you piece together the fact that they lost their daughter some time ago and are trying to process their grief in very different ways, which is shown through their dynamic. He is very much straight on, wants to move on from everything by acting like nothing happened and they can be just as they were before the tragedy happened. But she doesn't respond to that in any way because as a mother who helped that baby grow inside her for months, she is still numb. It's mentioned multiple times by her husband that she hasn't shed a tear since that day, but instead just keeps working on barely any sleep. She isn't able to just click a restart button and act like nothing happened. Through connecting to what happened to the family who lived in that house before and through seeing who she believes were ghosts, we realize she probably blames herself for the death of their child and wasn't able to process it till now. She longs for freedom that birds have while flying around. She wants to be free of this guilt and immense pain. The episode finished with her saying to her husband that she's finally ready to talk about their daughter, which symbolizes the fact that she's finally processing her trauma and grief after a long time we're suppressing it. That was all very well executed and I can't complain about it, which you can probably tell from my voice, but the conclusion felt rushed and left me wanting more. Something more sinister or unique at least. Not just, oh, she's imagining these ghosts because that's her way of coping with what she's feeling, because that's been done better a million times before in my personal opinion. Since there are so many elements I enjoyed, and at the same time so many that fell flat on their faces, I gave this one a personal rating of 5 out of 10. Next up is number 6, and this is where we meet the opening of this series. Lot 36, directed by Guillermo Navarro. An ex-vet buys storage locker contents to pay off debts, but buys more than he bargained for when he purchases a lot owned by a strange old man. This is a weird one to talk about because up until now, I still don't know how I feel about it entirely. Looking back and remembering my experience of watching it, it was a fun ride and I hated the protagonist every damn second he was on screen, which is practically the entire time. He is a racist, bitter asshole who low-key deserved what he got and I was rooting for the entity hard during the third act. If I'm not mistaken, this story was written by Gillermo del Toro himself, and I can see that in the way it is structured. You have to wait for quite a while to get any horror really. It doesn't happen until the third act. You know something about that lot is shady as fuck, and you know things will go south sooner or later, but that's entirely delivered through drama and a few jump scares put in the mix. I think this episode relies on jump scares the most, which makes sense because they work great in a setting of a dark, cluttered room that is everything but normal. The biggest problem I maybe had with this story was that it felt too long for what it has to tell. The beginning dragged and felt like 1 hour alone because, let's be honest, did we need all that setup to experience the story fully? No, and that's where they lost me. During the first act already, so even when we got to the third one, I barely gave a damn anymore. Felt bad for the priest dude though, he seemed genuinely nice. Although he should probably find a different hobby to begin with, but that's a discussion for another time. Once again, the story brings nothing new, except for the entity itself, which was something right out of a Junji Ito manga if you ever read any of those. Like, oh my god, straight out of nightmares. I gave this one a personal rating of 6 out of 10 and I feel pretty confident with that. Seems fair. At our next spot of number 5, we have Graveyard Rats, directed by Vincenzo Natali. A grave robber eyes the riches of a wealthy new arrival to the cemetery, but must survive a maze of tunnels and an army of rodents to secure them. Wasn't this a wacky-ass ride, huh? The cinematography of this one feels larger than life in a very realistic way, if that makes sense. Shots of beautiful churches, whole cities, and even a single hallway feel so grand, and I ate every scene up with my eyes. It was very gritty and greasy, which for some reason reminded me of Pirates of the Caribbean. It worked great in establishing the situation of our main character and why he was so desperate for money to begin with. Now, was he likable? No. Not at all if you asked me, but certainly more than Lot 36, dude. I still didn't root for him and instead was all the way on Team Rats. There aren't only absolutely disgusting shots of rats everywhere, eating human flesh, but also the entity that goes after him next to the small and giant rats. although unoriginal, sent shivers down my spine. If that ran after me, I would pass out right there on the spot. The giant rat was ridiculous, and for a second I thought I was watching some parody. But hey, did the job of making the whole space appear even smaller and sending my claustrophobic ass through some heavy breathing. Where this episode really nailed its place above all the other ones we already talked about is with the ending. I love how his desperation and pure greediness for money got him in this mess to begin with, but also were the only reason why he woke the entity in the very core of the tunnel. Literally, none of this would happen if he just accepted that this grave isn't for him to rob. We also find out that he is deadly afraid of being buried alive, and guess what? He ends up dying by being able to climb out of the tunnel but ending up in a closed coffin, dying from the lack of air, being eaten by those same rats he was so afraid of. He also got discovered by the same two robbers he scared away during the very first scene of the episode. It felt so satisfying to see everything wrapped up and justice being served to this greedy old man. I have a gripe though with the scene where a rat gets shot into pieces while the protagonist laughs like this is the funniest thing he's ever seen. I'm sorry, but as someone who is extremely sensitive to animal violence, I would appreciate a trigger warning or something. It came so out of the blue and truly upset me, so I lost the plot for a few seconds because I zoned out. Now you no longer wonder why I was team rats. Anyways, all of the choices that were made in how to show this story properly on screen were so unique and nothing I've ever seen before done in this exact way. I gave this one a personal rating of 7 out of 10 as a result, and I genuinely thought it would make my top 3 easily. Clearly I was wrong. We are only at number 4 now, and this place is taken by Dreams in the Witch House, directed by Catherine Hardwicke. Another name that might seem familiar because she directed the very first Twilight movie before bailing, and then the rest of the movies turned out looking like shit. But that's for another video in the future. Years after his twin sister's death, a researcher ventures into a dark, mysterious realm with the aid of a special drug determined to bring her back. If you find me just one person that didn't put this one in their bottom 2, I will applaud you. Everyone seems to absolutely despise this episode, and I'm not exactly sure I understand the reason behind it. It's probably because paranormal and supernatural shit like this always work for me, because I do believe in ghosts and spirits and all that. I'm also afraid of them, so this one was quite effective for me personally. Now, the main entity looks dumb and like it was dragged out of some kids movie, but damn, did I not expect it to win at the end? Stupid me, considering that in most episodes, evil actually does win for one reason or another. The main character, Walter, is played by Rupert Grint, the very man that played Ron in all Harry Potter movies. I adore him to death, and as a result, I was so excited to watch this episode. Thankfully, it didn't let me down, and although some stuff was left very messy or entirely unexplained, I was taken back by the gorgeous cinematography and intriguing main story. It showed how far we are willing to go to bring back someone we love unconditionally. Walter was never able to say goodbye to his little sister, and he simply wanted to bring her back home. With that though, he destroyed everything and ultimately lost his true self in the process. I'm ashamed to admit it, but I did cry during the last scene where he was wandering around the city, but not as himself anymore, but being controlled by that disgusting red dude, seemingly happy. I grew attached to Walter as a character and to his cause. I was rooting for him all the way, so seeing him lose at the end was heartbreaking, yet entirely unexpected. I gave this one a personal score of 7 out of 10 as well, but I did enjoy it more than the previous episode we talked about, so hence why I put it a place higher. Now we are finally at my top 3 episodes, starting with The Viewing in third place, directed by Panos Cosmatos. Walter Recluse hosts 4 accomplished guests at his stylish mansion for a once-in-a-lifetime experience, but their intrigue soon turns into terror. I'm sorry, but like, what? If you ask me right now what I watched during this entire episode, I have no idea. It's not necessarily that I wasn't able to follow the story and what was going down, but I have no idea what it tried to tell me. There is seemingly no message attached here, although I'm sure someone with more brain cells than me already figured it out. This very much feels like no plot, just vibes type of short film, and clearly I'm not opposed to that. I did expect for this to take the route of the Black Mirror episode called The Museum of Death, but well, I was wrong. The conversation they have during the middle part of the episode felt interesting for the first 2 minutes, and then I was ready to move on, but I simply couldn't. The story refused to move on from this random ass conversation for over half an hour, and I can't deny it. I checked multiple times how much time I had left till the end of the episode. With how intriguing and interesting the overall premise was, I think something way better could be done than just a random ass info dumping conversation and then an entity that eats over half of them while two are able to escape, barely fazed by what they just saw. I did enjoy the twist of the host clearly not knowing what he was dealing with when it came to this so-called stone and then getting fucked over by it and turned into this entity. I definitely thought he was going to pull something on them and get them killed, which would be a 10 out of 10 movie for me, by the way. But thanks to the stunning and crazily unique cinematography that gave me a feeling I was on drugs myself, was the only reason really why I stuck through the entire episode without major struggles. If it was dull looking, you better believe this would be at the bottom of my list. It's not though, because wow, I've never seen something like this before, and I can appreciate such talent being given to me on Netflix to watch. I feel like I should be paying more for this, honestly. Personal rating of 8 out of 10 from me. In the second spot, right under the very top, we have The Autopsy, directed by David Pryor, who also directed The Empty Man, if I'm not mistaken. Seasoned sheriff investigates a dead body in the woods and calls on an old pal, a medical examiner, to help piece together a series of chilling events. This would easily be number 1 if the first 30 minutes or so didn't feel like your typical crime TV show. I literally felt like I was watching NCIS or something, and although those shows are my jam all the way, I didn't exactly want it in an episode of this show. It's all very underwhelming and feels a bit info-dumpy because we just have no idea what's going on. Being spoon-fed information about the most random things we aren't able to connect together until the actual autopsy happens. I mean, I'm not a fan of body horror at all because it's mostly gross just for the sake of being gross. But when I tell you I was at the edge of my seat as soon as that dude woke up and walked straight out of the room with other bodies, I knew this shit was about to hit the fan. But I didn't imagine at all that this entity would try to move to the doctor. It did make sense entirely, don't get me wrong. As complicated as this story ended up being, it all wrapped up at the end and not a single detail was left unexplained. It's just that it did a complete 180 on me and I was left with my jaw on the floor when credits began to roll. I mean, that entity very much sounded funny as hell for some reason and reminded me of those Marvel movies called Venom and Venom Let There Be Carnage. I just couldn't take it seriously until it began to transfer to the body of the doctor. I had to look away a few times while he was trying to off himself, especially through ears, because absolutely fucking not. I'm not a creep for watching that yet. The fact he also left the message in his own blood for the sheriff fucked with my head and left me feeling not only blown away and terrified, but also sad because he sacrificed himself for his best friend despite only having a short time left to experience life to the fullest before cancer would eventually end it. Also, I need to give a shout out to the effect of that dude walking and bending all types of ways because of the entity inside him. It reminded me a lot of the transformations done in that Korean Netflix horror show, All of Us Are Dead, which I highly recommend if you haven't seen it yet. My personal score for The Autopsy ended up being 8 out of 10, and because of the slow starting point, this feels very fair. Finally, we arrived to my favorite episode of the entire series, which you by now know is The Outside, directed by Anna Lily Amipur. I'm sorry if I pronounced this wrong, I'm trying my best. Longing to fit in at work, awkward Stacy begins to use a popular lotion that causes an alarming reaction while an unnerving transformation takes shape. As basic as this premise sounds, and as much as I expected to get nothing but a generic, I want to be like other girls, I'm going to do a crazy thing to achieve that story, this was so much more than that. It is very much built from faster paced and slower paced moments, which can confuse the watcher a tiny bit, but there is no way any of you predicted that damn ending. I mean, the very ending Yes, of her becoming gorgeous and popular like she always wanted to be, but her killing her husband out of nothing with an axe and then bathing in all that lotion that previously walked around as an entity took me right out of left field. Because literally, what the fuck was that? Who even remembers something like that? Also, you can probably imagine how I felt as a non-body horror enjoyer when she started peeling all of her skin off. It was gross and I still want to throw up just thinking about it. This is your typical message of how media can manipulate us into going to extremes just to fit in, how they can make us believe we aren't good enough just as we are. Obviously, here it's taken to the utmost extreme, but I can't say I wasn't glued to the screen every step of the way. The performance of the lead actress was great, and when I realized she played Lucy in The Big Bang Theory, I had a minor crisis. Because of the weird and slightly off pacing, though, I gave this one a personal rating of 9 out of 10. Not quite a 10, but pretty much as close as we will get in this series. Overall, I do think this anthology series is worth a watch, and I would recommend you give it a go if you haven't seen it yet. Although you got spoiled for quite a lot of it at this point in the video. It definitely lacks horror that it was advertised to have, and relies a lot more on drama to drive many of these plots forward. But by no means do I think it is mid-quality. It's a good show, and I definitely hope we get season 2 at some point in time, because now I see why people trust Guillermo del Toro with their own lives. This man truly knows how to bring his vision to life, and although not all episodes followed a cohesive theme, they were all so different from each other and for sure touched at least some people. This series as a whole gets a personal rating of 8 out of 10 from me because it bloody deserves it, and I'm excited to get chills down my spine again when we hopefully get more horror content from this amazing director. As for me, I will see you again here very soon when we talk about some new piece of cinema that left a positive or maybe not so positive impact on me.